We are now recording. Okay, so I'm going to start us first with what we heard from the community. What we heard from folks across the city. So on the peninsula, folks from James Island, folks from Johns Island, folks from Daniel Island, Wando community. These are things that we heard from all areas of the city. People are very concerned about our local ecosystems and wanting to see those preserved and restored going forward, and increased access to our natural environment, especially free public access to the water in places where there currently is limited access to the water, and green space as well. We have a lot of challenges with our infrastructure to manage water and our transportation systems. And so wanting to see more coordination and collaboration with the many jurisdictions that are doing that work so that we can make more improvements, and especially making sure that those improvements are being made and those investments made in older communities, not just newer developments. The urban growth boundary, which is something that doesn't come up much from the peninsula, so that's on sort of more on the outskirts of the city. But this is the bold line on the map to the left here for the phone callers. It's a bold line that goes out about around the Francis Marion Forest on the Kenai Peninsula, past West Ashley Circle, West Ashley, about to where Main Road meets with, or sorry, Maybank Highway meets with Main Road on Johns Island, down by the airport as well, and then James Island right around the Grimball Road area. And this urban growth boundary line is what we use to inform land use recommendations to preserve rural development outside of the urban growth boundary, to limit where that urban type of development and suburban can extend. And so folks want to see this protected and maintained, and also that transitional area better managed. And again, that's requiring collaboration with other jurisdictions. We also heard a lot about from all folks about the importance of the city's Gullah Geechee history and culture, and wanting to see that better reflected, better protected and preserved. For our local business community, wanting to see more affordable commercial space and more support for our small local businesses. On the subject of housing, a resounding call for housing, a mixture of housing that meets not just the needs of all income levels, but also life stages, household sizes, also more housing close to where people work. People want to see a more connected city, and not just for cars, but for folks who are walking, riding their bikes, using transit. And then finally, appreciation of the engagement, this engagement opportunity, and wanting to see that extend beyond the comprehensive plan, be more on an ongoing basis, and seeing more general transparency and improved communication from the planning department, but also all departments of the city. And these are things that we heard specifically or more heightened from residents on the peninsula. The peninsula is loved, is unique for its historic buildings, scenic views of the harbor. This is what brings tourists to the area. It's also loved by residents. There's a diversity of residential communities on the peninsula. It's not just a commercial center, but it also has a vibrant commercial center. There's a lot of arts, culture, food scene. There's a lot of activity, a lot of opportunities for connection. So this is what we heard from folks in response to the question, what do you love most about your community and living in the city of Charleston? We also heard a lot about flooding concerns, which we all know are significant on the peninsula, wanting to see plans for continued improvements to drainage and infrastructure, and considering other flooding solutions, and how important this is for the future of the peninsula community and its ability to be viable and to thrive going forward. The street network of Peninsula, aside from being regularly flooded, is also people are concerned about the safety, especially for bikers and pedestrians. So wanting to see more improvements to streets to prioritize transits, pedestrians, cyclists, and have more connectivity. And we heard from a lot of folks about what feels like, what's perceived as sort of an uneven distribution of services and investments for neighborhoods on the peninsula. So wanting to see attention and services being provided to all areas equally, and that and also to strike a better balance between quality of life for residents and also accommodating our tourist population, which is very important for the city's economy. And then finally, more grocery stores. We heard a lot for the peninsula, reviving local corner store, quality public schools, and considering free parking for residents, more public bathrooms. So these are other things that came up in terms of amenities that Peninsula residents would like to see more of and have nearby. Okay. This next section is focused on the key findings from our water and land analysis. One of our guiding principles for this plan was water first, so under planning with a mind toward where water is and is going to be. And so we hired a group of consultants led by Wagner Ball and the Water Institute of the Gulf, which are the same folks that we worked with for Dutch Dialogues. And what we asked them to do was apply those same Dutch Dialogue principles. If you're not familiar with Dutch Dialogues, we can share a link to that report in the chat, but applying those same principles to the citywide level to inform our planning and land use recommendations going forward. So first, an overview of how they approached this analysis. They brought in the Dutch Dialogues layered planning concept, looking at habitation, which is where the city plan is mostly focused. This is primarily a land use plan that will guide development and land use decisions over the next 10 years. So we're really influencing that in habitation level. On the infrastructure level, though the plan will not address specific projects, we can include recommendations for areas needing priority investment for drainage and transportation networks improvements. And in all of these, their approach to this layered planning is saying, in habitation and infrastructure needs to have that ground level analysis as well. And that's what we are missing. And so that is what this analysis is primarily focused on, was understanding our soil, water, ecology, our landscape, and our waterscape, and how that will be changing in the coming years and how we can plan accordingly. Their analysis yielded an almost 300-page report, and that is online for folks who really want to read through all of the technical details. It's a highly technical report. It's really great information, but it's too much to present tonight. So I'm just going to focus tonight on this elevation risk zones map, which breaks the city down into these 4 categories of high ground, adapt zone, compound flood risk zone, and tidal flood risk zones. And these zones are based on elevation related risk. The high ground is where we have the lowest flood risk, but also the greatest responsibility to the downstream neighbors. For the adapt zone, this is where flooding, storm surge flooding and rain related flooding is less frequent, but it's not impossible. In the compound flood risk zone areas, this is sort of a zone that is an overlap where the adapt zone and the tidal flood risk zone overlap. And there's a combination, a mixture of flooding influences that can be highly complex. And the tidal flood risk zone, these are our lowest lying areas in the city, where 100% of the zone is in the 100-year floodplain, where flooding can take place on a sunny day just from high tide events. And this is where we're going to see potentially marsh migration, which just means the marsh moving inland as the sea level rises. So this is a very dynamic zone, very vulnerable area. This is a zoomed in picture of the map looking specifically at the Charleston Peninsula. And you can see most of the high ground areas on the peninsula are in the upper part of the peninsula in the neck, moving up toward North Charleston. With Laurel Island also shows up as a high ground area. And then the majority of the remaining of the peninsula is an adapt zone that follows the spine up through the center part of the peninsula, sort of almost parallel to I-26. The analysis also contained sort of recommended planning strategies to be considered for all of these areas, for all of these zones. So these are strategies that need to be used in combination in all areas of the city. So there are some places where we can grow responsibly, as long as we have the proper mitigation strategies in place. There are areas of the city where we need to restore and preserve our natural ecosystems. And a lot of areas of the city where adaptation and defense are going to be important in the years to come. And so understanding which combination of these to apply, that combination will be primarily based on site-specific conditions. So there's a lot more to it than elevation, and you'll see that in the Water First blog post that we have on the city plan. There's a lot more layers to it, and those are harder to make generalizations about on a citywide level. So we will need to have more site-specific analysis as we go forward, and these planning strategies will be can be enforced primarily through zoning code, stormwater regulations, and other policies and so forth. But you won't see these reflected in the more high-level generalized land use categories. And then finally, one of the strategies here you see is defend. And I'll read that definition for those on the phone. So defend is protect buildings and infrastructure with engineered measures such as berms, flood walls, and pumps. Defensive measures should be reserved for areas with the highest risk and lowest sensitivity, which just means that's where the displacement of the flood water will not exacerbate risk elsewhere. So in the report, if you go look up the report online, you'll see that the peninsula is one of these areas where the defend strategy, planning strategy, is going to need to be used a lot, and already is being used. So there are already examples of these types of protective measures like the low and high battery. And we'll need to continue to pursue strategies like this going in the future. And so because of these existing and future protections, we are approaching the peninsula in a tailored way in terms of land use recommendations that are going to be different and unique from other parts of the city that don't have those same protections in place in terms of engineered structures. One example of this is, and some of you have cited this as one of the reasons why you're here, is the storm surge barrier protection under study right now by the Army Corps of Engineers in partnership with the city. And so this is just one piece of a larger puzzle. And that study is still underway and the design is not final. But we are this is even though this is a 10-year plan, the analysis, the water and land use analysis, is based on a 50-year timeline. And so the recommendations that we make in this 10-year plan are in thinking of those that future that may be 20, 30, 40, 50 years out. And so what we are including the assumption in this plan that we will be pursuing protective measures for the peninsula, like the barrier protection under study right now by the Army Corps of Engineers. But it's important to note that there's no single solution to address the peninsula's flooding challenges. There are a variety of different types of flooding challenges, and the Army Corps study is focused on specifically storm surge as a challenge. So we'll need to be pursuing a variety of strategies and approaches going forward, as we already have been with a lot of the stormwater projects underway. Jim, I don't know if you have this link handy, but if we could share the link to the stormwater projects story map in the chat, if you can find that, that if you're interested in learning more about the current stormwater projects for the peninsula, that is a great resource to learn more about those. I'm going to pause real quick because that was a lot, and just have a sip of water and let that sink in.
Well, while Chloe is having a sip of water, are there any questions or thoughts, questions or feedback that anyone has? Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Satika. Okay. All right. One of our other great challenges that we are addressing with this plan is our housing and the need for affordable housing in the city. So we contracted with a consultant community data platform that specializes in data analytics to help us have access to better data to understand our existing housing stock and essentially match, understand our housing stock in terms of cost, compare that with the income distribution of our existing residents, and understand where is our greatest need for housing going forward in terms of housing costs and housing type. And so I want to preface these findings with a definition that is, the term affordable housing, which there are a lot of different definitions for and understandings for. For simplicity's sake, in the context of this analysis, we are using a broader definition of affordable housing than you may be accustomed to. So first, when we say what is affordable or how is affordability measured, we are using the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development's definition, which is housing is affordable to a household if it costs no more than 30% of that household's annual income, and that's calculated before taxes. They categorize different levels of affordability for different income ranges based on the household's annual income and the percentage, they take the area median income and they calculate, this is hard to explain. Let me start over. There are different categories, they categorize income ranges based on that household's income's percentage of the area median income. So for example, if housing units that are affordable for someone making 60% of the area median income, that means that that housing has been set at a price or subsidized such that the housing cost is no more than 30% of $34,020 a year annually. And so that's how that's calculated. So there are different ranges, sort of different levels, different tiers of affordability. Sometimes you'll see the 60% and below referred to as low income housing, 80% to 120% workforce housing. And what we are saying is when we talk about the need for affordable housing in the city, we are talking about all of these income ranges. So we're not just talking about workforce housing. We're not just talking about low income housing. We're talking about the need across this income spectrum. So when we looked at, compared the income to the housing stock, we also looked at how many people currently are paying more than that 30% of their annual income on housing costs. And the term for that often is cost burden households. On average for the city overall was 42%. On Peninsula, it's showing us 41%. And we also looked at, because this is what we had the data for, we know that there's income disparities across race, specifically between Black and white households. So when we looked at cost burdenness across race, we saw that this is much higher for predominantly Black neighborhoods. Neighborhoods with majority of Black residents are more than twice as likely to be cost burdened as those with a majority of white residents. So I'm highlighting this. There's a problem citywide across all race and ethnicity groups, but this is it's not evenly felt. It's not equally felt and experienced. So this needs to be considered as we approach our challenges, our solutions. We also understand that housing costs are not the only reason why people choose to live where they live. Could be proximity to work, their age, their household size. So these are things that we need to consider as we plan for housing in the future. We also need to, of course, plan for housing with a mind to areas that will be vulnerable to tidal flooding and other types of flooding going forward. And the vulnerability assessment that was completed last year found that 6% of residential parcels, existing residential parcels, will be vulnerable to tidal flooding with 3 feet sea level rise, which is the prediction. That's the scenario we are using right now to inform our planning. And we see when you compare transportation and housing costs, or sorry, not compare, but when you combine them, you get a different picture of affordability across the city. So maybe you're saving on the housing cost side, but you might be paying more than transportation. And so this is a comparison across the city. And what's interesting with this is the average housing costs combined with transportation costs for the Peninsula actually puts it as slightly more affordable than Johns Island, for example, and much more affordable than Kenai Peninsula, which includes Daniel Island and Wando. And then finally, we looked at what we compared the gap for affordable housing across the city, not just looking at our existing residents and income distribution, but our projected population growth over the next 10 years with that same income distribution and what the need would be in each area of the city. And it's significant. So almost 5,000 more affordable units, which remember is across that income spectrum, just would be needed to meet to close the gap that we now have. Now, there are other things that can close that gap, like increased wages, for example, could help close that gap. Housing costs, if they were to go down, could help close that gap. But this is just highlighting what the gap is and will continue to be over the next 10 years. If housing costs and income distribution, if that ratio stays the same over the next 10 years. And I also want to highlight that the need is greatest for the income range, that 30% of the area median income and below. So we have a gap of 7,000 units today to meet the income needs of those residents. The last findings that I want to share with folks is the settlement community is, well, I don't know about findings is the right word, but an update on a project that we've been working on that will reference later in the recommendations. And this is acknowledging where settlement communities, African-American settlement communities are across the city. And this is a work in progress. We are regularly or still in the process of gathering stories and meeting with folks and updating and verifying these maps. But the purpose of this is to recognize the historical and cultural significance of African-American settlement communities, which are founded by freed Gullah people and their descendants throughout the Lowcountry, especially during the Reconstruction era. They're all unique and their stories are all different, but their similarities are in their shared, each has a shared history, a shared identity. They have shared cultural institutions such as schools, churches, and businesses, and there's a strong connection to the land and place. And so the goal for the city plan is to get a comprehensive map of just the locations and the names of the communities, and to include recommendations as we move forward to continue working in partnership with these communities to support their goals for the future. And that concludes my section. So we'll pause here because I know that was a lot of information. We still.
All right, does anyone have any questions or thoughts based on the findings or the feedback that Chloe's sharing? Okay. All right. Okay, well then, Christopher, we'll go ahead and give it to you. Did we lose Christopher? Oh.
Okay, if we can pull the slides up, please. Okay, so we're going to go through some of the draft recommendations that we're working on and still refining in the plan. And just a reminder, many of you have seen a version of this slide before, but it's just important to understand that just by virtue of putting together this plan and having City Council adopt this plan, it doesn't change the zoning. It doesn't change the stormwater regulations. These are all things that are separate ordinances and are kind of, it's a step in the process. In other words, you create the plan and then you can create other ordinances that help enforce the plan. It's essentially a guiding document for the future policies. And of course, we'll still be working on small area neighborhood plans that will give us even more detail than the kind of 30,000 foot view of the comprehensive plan. Next slide. And of course, we have our 10 elements from the state. And these are elements that are required. There are 9 that are required. We have a 10th that we're incorporating that the state suggests and we think is essential, which is a resilience element. And of course, we will have a key tie of resilience throughout our plan, but we will be using this resilience section to kind of summarize all the resilience activities within the plan itself. Next slide. And we have our future land use map, which is a thing that, probably is one of the greatest used items from a comprehensive plan in the way they're set up in South Carolina. And it essentially is a visual guide for land use and development in the city. It's an articulation of the community's vision of how we would develop, where we might expand or not expand, where we would redevelop, things like that. It does guide decisions on things like zoning now and into the future, but it's not an actual zoning ordinance or zoning map. Next slide. And our water analysis implications for the land use, which are so important and, in here for the first time in this plan, not in previous plans that we've had at the city, are to reserve higher intensity land uses for the higher ground zones, and then to assign the lowest impact land use categories such as conservation and parks to the majority of areas within the tidal flood risk area. Now, for downtown, it is a little bit unique due to its existing and future barrier protections under study. We feel that there's a tailored approach that has to be taken to the elevation-based land use recommendations for the Peninsula area. And it should be understood that, we are making the assumption in this plan that there will be barrier protection of some degree in line with, what the Corps has been looking at, and potentially incorporating some of the recommendations that we've gotten from Wagner and Ball in their study of the Corps' work. Everywhere between the higher intensity high ground areas and the lower intensity tidal flood risk areas can accommodate mid to low intensity land use categories, but you still have to have site specific planning and mitigation strategies. Those involve looking at what the soils are, looking at what the surrounding drainage basin is doing, looking at what kind of drainage easements there might be, or other drainage improvements the city might have put in, such as the tunnel systems that we have in several areas of the city, or incorporating in another area of the city too soon. So these are all factors that come into play, particularly in the downtown area. Next slide. So in our document, we have a number of land use categories, and these start at the outer edge, out beyond our urban growth boundary with the rural areas. And these are areas that, typically the city is not expanding into. There may be some previous annexations from 20 or 30 years ago that are into these areas, but we're trying to make sure that those are all low density of 1 unit per acre or less. That's in line with Charleston County's recommendations. And that helps us preserve the urban growth boundary. On the inner edge of the urban growth boundary would be what we call suburban edge. And these are neighborhoods that are suburban in character, but the densities are typically lower than most of our other suburban areas. These are typically 1 dwelling unit an acre to 4 dwelling units an acre. Sandhurst might be an example out in West Ashland. Then we have our more typical suburban areas, which are 4 to 8 units an acre. And we actually are showing an image right here that is from Wagner Terrace, because Wagner Terrace exemplifies all that and actually has an incredible range of housing types, so much so that the single family housing in Wagner Terrace is only about half the housing. The other half of the housing units in Wagner Terrace come from duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings, condos, things like that. But other examples of suburban neighborhoods are Riverland Terrace, Avondale, and St. John's Woods on Johns Island. Next slide. Then we have our neighborhood designation, which a good bit of downtown is. This is areas like Ansonboro or Harleston Village or Charlestown. And these are a mix of uses, but they're primarily residential. They have regular block patterns and a wide range of building types. These are typically 6 to 12 dwelling units an acre. Again, Ansonboro is an example, or in the Upper Peninsula, Hampton Park Terrace. Then we have neighborhood edge, which is a new category that we are creating, that is the types of development you find around the edges of neighborhoods, such as along major roadways. It's where those key services are provided for a neighborhood. The key services not being able to locate right in the center of a neighborhood because of transportation access, things like that. So they're typically on the edge, and they still can provide very walkable centers, such as we have in Avondale Point in West Ashley, but they are definitely different from the heart of a neighborhood. And then finally, we have our city centers, which you all know well in downtown, the King Meeting Corridor, but there also are other city centers around town, such as Daniel Allen Town Center, some areas on Johns Island that are future city centers, some areas in West Ashley like Citadel Mall that could become a city center, areas on Sam Rittenberg and out in Clements Ferry, and also on James Island. Next slide. We have some very specialized areas in our plan too, and these are our campus areas, such as the medical district in the heart of downtown, which is the greatest concentration of employment in the entire Charleston region. Over 20,000 employees there go to work and do their jobs there every day. We also have our job center category. You don't really see this on the peninsula, but these are typically in West Ashley or Cainhoy, where you have a lot of small businesses, and a lot of the job creation in our city comes from these areas, and they're not typical block patterns. They might be a lot of office warehouse type facilities, things like that. And then we have our industrial areas, which for downtown is the upper neck area over towards the Cooper River, where there's deep water access, and you do have some of the most intense type of industry up there. Next slide. Then our new category, the low impact and conserved area, and this is the two types of land areas that are low elevation lands with flood risk and future marsh migration areas. And some of these might see a little bit of limited development, but structures are likely to have to be elevated. Again, this would be applied in areas like Johns Island or James Island, where we have these low impact and conserved areas, and other structures that might be in those areas at present, we'd work to adapt and defend depending on their particular situation. Hopefully a lot of this area could also be lands preserved via public ownership or private ownership that has preservation or conservation easements. Then we, of course, have natural or wetland areas, which have been here for centuries and have always been part of our landscape. And then we have parks that are extensively around the city, historic parks, as well as newer suburban athletic oriented parks. An example here, of course, being downtown's Hampton Park. Next slide. So here we have our first draft of our future land use for the peninsula. And what you see there, the darkest color is that city center color coming through the center of the city, following really the route of the low country rapid transit down the King and Meeting spine of the city. Originally, this category went all the way to Broad Street, incorporated all of Broad Street, but we felt that we needed to back it up from that area, given the historic buildings, given the nature of the blocks in that area. It's not really a place that the bigger buildings would go. Those are targeted more towards Upper Peninsula. And so we stopped the city center at Market Street in this new version of the plan. That's a little bit different from previous plans. This also has the Upper Peninsula area, or NOMO, is within the city center, and Laurel Island, which has its recently approved planned unit development, and then Magnolia, which has a planned unit development that was approved just a few years ago. And then you have the job centers and the industrial areas in the neck. And you also have mostly neighborhood level density around downtown, from areas around College of Charleston to Charlestown to the French Quarter to Ansonboro and the East Side, all through there. And then we do have a little bit lower density existing. This is all based on existing uses and densities, but a little bit lower density in Wagner Terrace because of the time frame in which that was built. And then I think I've identified, we do have the proposed low country rapid transit route, all shown through here, coming into the Peninsula on Meeting Street, turning on Calhoun, going through the medical district around West Edge and back out. We do have a couple of areas of African-American settlement areas identified with the dotted lines, like up in the neck area and Upper Peninsula. Next slide. This is just an image of parks and conserved lands. In downtown, they're typically smaller and more scattered, so it's harder to see them, but they are on the map. In our suburban areas, they're kind of bigger and further between. So sometimes they look like they're more in the suburban areas, but downtown has a very good share of those as well. Next slide. So we've talked a little bit about these, but I'll just kind of do a little summary of how we have in our changes in land use from the previous plan. We've had areas for future growth are being determined now in this plan, this first time ever, by elevation considerations, the high ground and current and future transit and infrastructure first. That means that where we're putting the city center areas, it has close proximity to that new low country rapid transit and also has better elevation than other areas. The neighborhood edge designations are more the periphery of neighborhoods and the place of connection between the nearby residential areas and major multimodal transportation routes. Again, those don't really apply very much in downtown. And then we have our low impact and preserved designation, which is in a lot of areas of the city, but by virtue of having the perimeter protection as part of our grand plan for the city, there's less of this in the downtown area. Then we have our city center designation. In previous plans, this has been called the urban core or urban center areas. And of course, it encompasses a variety of urban scale development. And then our neighborhood designation, which is a lot of the neighborhoods in the downtown. And it's in previous plans, it had been described as urban. And then of course, the settlement communities. Next slide. And then we have Laurel Island, that based on its PUD being adopted last year, was changed from city center from industrial. It was in the past. The hospital district, we changed from urban core to campus because it's really much more specialized than urban core. And then the documented historic cemeteries are included in our low impact and conserved areas. And we have some of the neck that was changed from job center to from industrial to job center. And city center is still highest concentrated in the peninsula along the spine. And we have expanded some of it in the upper Meeting and upper King areas in line with where some of the highest land on the peninsula is. Next slide. And this is where we move on into our group discussion.